The sun peeked over the rolling hills of Oakville, Missouri, casting a warm glow across the fields of the Callahan farm. It was a day like any other, filled with the promise of hard work and simple pleasures. The old red barn, weathered by years of sun and rain, stood as a silent sentinel over the property. Inside, a heartwarming scene was unfolding, unknown to the farm's human inhabitants. Jake, a magnificent golden retriever with a coat that shimmered like spun gold in the early morning light, watched over his 5 playful puppies. His brown eyes, filled with warmth and patience, followed their every move as they tumbled and wrestled in the soft hay. The puppies, barely 6 weeks old, were bundles of energy and curiosity. Their tiny paws kicked up small clouds of dust as they chased each other, their high-pitched yips and barks filling the air with joy. The bond between Jake and his puppies was something to behold. Wherever Jake went, 5 little shadows followed, their tails wagging in perfect unison. There was Max, the largest of the litter, always ready for a game of tug-of-war. Daisy, the only girl, had a coat as golden as her father's and a gentle nature that belied her playful spirit. Buddy and Charlie were nearly identical, often mistaken for each other, but Jake could tell them apart by the unique sparkle in their eyes. And then there was Rusty, the runt of the litter, who made up for his small size with an oversized personality. Jake had created a cozy den for his family in a corner of the barn, away from drafts and hidden from casual observers. He'd gathered old blankets and straw, forming a nest that was both comfortable and secure. It was here that he'd kept vigil when the puppies were born, and it was here that he continued to watch over them, a steadfast guardian. As the puppies played, Jake's ears perked up at the sound of approaching footsteps. He recognized the gait immediately. It was Henry, the farmer who had been Jake's companion for the past 7 years. Jake's tail began to wag, but he didn't leave his post. He knew Henry would come to him. Henry Callahan was a man shaped by the land he worked. His hands were calloused from years of labor, his face weathered by sun and wind. But his blue eyes sparkled with kindness, especially when they fell upon Jake. At 55, Henry had known his share of hardships. He'd lost his wife, Sarah, to cancer 5 years ago, and since then, it had been just him and Jake on the farm. "There you are, old boy," Henry said as he entered the barn, his voice gruff but affectionate. He knelt down beside Jake, running a hand through the dog's thick fur. "Ready for another day?" Jake leaned into Henry's touch, his tail thumping against the barn floor. For a moment, he was torn between his loyalty to Henry and his devotion to his puppies. But Henry hadn't noticed the little ones yet, and Jake wasn't ready to share his secret. Henry stood up, stretching his back. "Well, come on then. Those cows won't feed themselves." With a soft whine, Jake nuzzled each of his puppies, giving them a gentle lick before rising to follow Henry. The puppies, used to this routine, settled down for a nap, a pile of golden fur and soft snores. As Jake and Henry made their way across the farmyard, the day began in earnest. The rooster crowed from atop the chicken coop, announcing the arrival of morning to all who would listen. In the distance, the cows lowed, eager for their breakfast. The farm was coming to life, a symphony of animal sounds and the creaking of old wood as the barn settled in the warming air. Jake trotted alongside Henry, matching his pace to the farmer's long strides. They made quite a pair, the tall, lean farmer in his worn overalls and the noble golden retriever, moving in perfect harmony. Their routine was well established, a dance they'd perfected over years of working side by side. First came the cows. Jake helped herd them from the pasture into the milking barn, his bark gentle but insistent. He knew just how to move to guide the cows without startling them. Henry often marveled at Jake's intuition, the way he seemed to know exactly what needed to be done. "Don't know what I'd do without you, Jake," Henry muttered as he set about the milking. Jake sat nearby, alert for any sign of trouble. He knew his job was to keep watch, to be Henry's second set of eyes and ears. As the morning wore on, they moved from task to task, feeding the chickens, checking the fences, and inspecting the crops that were just beginning to sprout in the fields. Jake was there for it all, his presence a constant comfort to Henry. By midday, the sun was high in the sky, beating down on them with an intensity that hinted at the long, hot summer to come. Henry wiped the sweat from his brow with a bandana he kept in his back pocket. "Phew, it's a scorcher today, isn't it, boy?" he said to Jake, who was panting heavily, his pink tongue lolling out. They made their way back to the farmhouse, a two-story structure that had stood for generations. Its white paint was peeling in places, and the porch sagged slightly, but to Henry, it was home. Inside, it was cool and dim, a welcome respite from the heat outside. Henry filled Jake's water bowl and set about making himself a simple lunch, a sandwich made with thick slices of homemade bread and ham from last fall's butchering. As he ate, he gazed out the window at his land. The fields stretched out before him, green and promising. But there was something in the air, a heaviness that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Storm's coming," he murmured to himself. Jake, who had been lying at Henry's feet, lifted his head at the words. He could sense it too, a change in the air pressure, a distant rumble that was more felt than heard. Henry's eyes scanned the horizon. In the distance, dark clouds were gathering, their edges tinged with an ominous green. He'd seen clouds like that before, and they never boded well. "Looks like we might be in for a rough night, Jake," he said, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. Jake whined softly, his thoughts turning to his puppies in the barn. He needed to get back to them, to make sure they were safe and secure before the storm hit. But he couldn't leave Henry, not when the farmer might need his help battening down the hatches. As the afternoon wore on, the sky grew darker, and the wind began to pick up. Henry and Jake worked quickly, securing loose items around the farm and making sure the animals were safely in their shelters. The chickens were ushered into their coop, the cows brought in from the pasture and secured in the milking barn. All the while, Jake's anxiety grew. He needed to check on his puppies, to make sure they were safe. But every time he thought about slipping away, Henry called for his help with another task. Finally, as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, Henry turned to Jake. "All right, boy, I think we've done all we can. Let's get inside before this really hits." Jake hesitated, torn between following Henry to the safety of the farmhouse and racing to the barn to be with his puppies. The sky lit up with a flash of lightning, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The storm was upon them. In that moment, Jake made his decision. With a apologetic whine, he turned and raced towards the barn, leaving a startled Henry calling after him. "Jake, Jake, come back." But Jake couldn't turn back. He had a secret life in that barn, a family that needed him. As he ran, the wind howled around him, whipping his fur and driving the rain into his eyes. The storm was unleashing its fury, but Jake's determination never wavered. He reached the barn just as another bolt of lightning split the sky. Inside, he could hear the frightened whimpers of his puppies. They needed him now more than ever. As he nosed his way into their nest, 5 little bodies immediately pressed against him, seeking comfort and safety. Jake curled around his puppies, his body a shield against the storm that raged outside. He could hear the wind howling, the rain pounding against the roof of the barn. But here, in this little corner, he had created a haven of warmth and security. As the night deepened and the storm raged on, Jake stood guard over his precious cargo. He didn't know what challenges the night might bring, but he was ready to face them. For his puppies, for his family, he would be strong. The bond between them was unbreakable, a force more powerful than any storm. And so, as the wind howled and the rain fell in sheets, Jake held his vigil, a golden guardian in the heart of the storm. The storm hit Oakville with a fury that shook the very foundations of the Callahan farm. Rain pounded against the old red barn's roof, creating a deafening drumbeat that drowned out almost every other sound. The wind howled like a wild beast, finding every crack and crevice in the weathered wood, its eerie whistling adding to the cacophony of the tempest. Inside the barn, Jake stood guard over his puppies, his body a furry shield against the elements. The wooden crate that held his precious cargo creaked and groaned under the pressure of the wind, but Jake's determination never wavered. His brown eyes, usually so warm and gentle, were now alert and filled with fierce protectiveness. The puppies, usually so playful and boisterous, were now huddled together in a tight ball of golden fur. Max, the largest, was at the center, with Daisy, Buddy, Charlie, and little Rusty pressed against him for warmth and comfort. Their tiny whimpers were barely audible over the roar of the storm, but to Jake, they might as well have been screams. Each frightened sound tore at his heart, strengthening his resolve to keep them safe. As a particularly loud clap of thunder shook the barn, Jake's ears perked up. He heard something else, something that made his heart race even faster. It was the sound of water, not just rain hitting the roof, but water flowing, rushing, rising. The barn door, old and warped from years of Missouri weather, had been left slightly ajar in the chaos of the storm's arrival. Now, it was allowing a steady stream of water to seep into the barn. Jake knew he had to act fast. The water was already ankle-deep and rising quickly. He looked at the crate containing his puppies, then at the barn door, calculating. With a strength that belied his gentle nature, Jake began to push the crate towards the door. His muscles strained with the effort, his paws slipping on the wet barn floor, but he refused to give up. Inch by inch, Jake moved the crate. The puppies inside whimpered louder, frightened by the sudden movement and the rising water. Jake paused for a moment, sticking his nose into the crate to nuzzle them reassuringly. His presence seemed to calm them, their trust in him absolute. He was their protector, their hero, and they knew, even in their young minds, that he would keep them safe. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was really only minutes, Jake managed to push the crate to the barn door. The wind caught the door, flinging it open with a bang that startled the puppies into a chorus of yelps. Jake quickly positioned himself between the open door and the crate, shielding his family from the full force of the storm. Outside, the world had transformed into a raging torrent. The usually peaceful fields of the Callahan farm were now a churning lake, the floodwaters rising with alarming speed. Jake's keen eyes scanned the area, looking for higher ground. In the distance, he could see the slight rise where Henry's farmhouse stood. It wasn't much, but it was their best chance. With a deep breath, Jake stepped out into the storm, pulling the crate behind him. The water was cold and relentless, immediately soaking through his thick fur. The current was strong, tugging at his legs, trying to sweep him off his feet. But Jake fought against it with every ounce of his being. His love for his puppies fueled his determination, giving him strength he didn't know he possessed. Every step was a battle. The crate, though chosen for its lightness, now felt like it was made of lead. The water kept rising, soon reaching Jake's chest. He had to swim now, pulling the crate behind him like a boat. Inside, the puppies were eerily quiet, as if they sensed the gravity of their situation and were doing their best to make things easier for their father. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the farm in stark, electric blue. In that brief flash, Jake saw something that made his heart sink. The route to the farmhouse was completely flooded, the waters too deep and the current too strong. He wouldn't be able to make it there with the puppies in tow. He needed a new plan, and fast. Another flash of lightning revealed a glimmer of hope. The old oak tree that stood at the edge of the Callahan property was on slightly higher ground. Its massive trunk and sprawling roots created a natural barrier against the flood. If Jake could make it there, they might have a chance. Changing direction, Jake swam with all his might towards the oak tree. The going was tough, each stroke a monumental effort. The crate bumped and jostled behind him, but Jake was careful to keep it steady, knowing how precious and fragile its cargo was. As they neared the tree, Jake's strength began to wane. He was exhausted, every muscle in his body screaming for rest. The cold water had numbed his limbs, making each movement a supreme act of will. But he couldn't stop. His puppies needed him. They were depending on him, and Jake would rather die than let them down. With a final, Herculean effort, Jake reached the base of the oak tree. The ground here was indeed higher, the water only coming up to his chest now. But it was still rising, and Jake knew they weren't safe yet. He needed to get the puppies higher. Using his nose and paws, Jake managed to push the crate up onto a large, gnarled root that protruded from the ground. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the puppies out of the water for now. Jake heaved himself up next to the crate, his body trembling with exhaustion. For a moment, all was quiet except for the ongoing roar of the storm. Jake's breath came in heavy pants, his sides heaving with the effort. He nosed open the crate, checking on his puppies. They were wet and shivering, but alive. 5 pairs of eyes looked up at him, filled with trust and love. Jake's heart swelled with pride and relief. They had made it this far. But the night was far from over. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the waters continued to rise. Jake knew he had to stay alert, ready to move the puppies higher if necessary. He curled his body around the crate, providing what warmth and protection he could. As the long night wore on, Jake's thoughts turned to Henry. He hoped his human friend had made it safely to the farmhouse. A pang of guilt hit him as he remembered running away from Henry when the storm hit. But surely Henry would understand. He had to protect his family. The wind howled, driving rain and debris through the branches of the old oak. Jake used his body to shield the puppies, wincing as twigs and leaves pelted his back. He was their only defense against the elements, and he took his job seriously. Hours passed, each one feeling like an eternity. The water level fluctuated, sometimes receding a bit, only to rise again with renewed vigor. Jake remained vigilant, ready to move at a moment's notice. His muscles ached, his fur was matted and tangled, but his spirit remained unbroken. As the first faint light of dawn began to break through the storm clouds, Jake allowed himself a small moment of hope. They had survived the night. His puppies were safe, huddled together in their crate, sleeping the exhausted sleep of those who have faced great danger and emerged unscathed. Jake's ears perked up at a new sound cutting through the diminishing storm. It was faint at first, but growing stronger. A voice. A human voice. Calling his name. Jake. Jake, where are you, boy? It was Henry. Jake's tail, despite his exhaustion, began to wag. Help was coming. They were going to be okay. With the last of his strength, Jake let out a bark. It was hoarse and weak, but it was enough. He saw Henry in the distance, wading through the floodwaters, his face a mixture of worry and relief. As Henry drew closer, his eyes widened in surprise at the sight of the crate and the puppies. But there was no time for explanations now. They needed to get to safety. Together, Henry and Jake managed to secure the crate and began the treacherous journey back to the farmhouse. The waters were receding, but the danger wasn't over yet. Jake stayed close to the crate, his protective instincts still in high gear. Finally, after what seemed like hours, they reached the farmhouse. It stood strong, a beacon of safety in the flood-ravaged landscape. As they entered the warm, dry interior, Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had made it. His puppies were safe. Henry carefully set the crate down, his hands gentle as he checked on the puppies. They were cold and wet, but otherwise unharmed. Jake watched anxiously as Henry wrapped them in warm towels, his heart full of gratitude for his human friend. "You old hero," Henry murmured, his voice thick with emotion as he turned to Jake. "You saved them. I don't know how you did it, but you saved them." Jake wagged his tail weakly, accepting Henry's praise and the gentle scratch behind his ears. But his eyes never left the puppies. He had done his job. He had protected his family. And now, finally, he could rest. As the storm outside began to abate, a new day dawned on the Callahan farm. The world had been changed by the flood, but some things remained constant. The love of a dog for his family. The bond between a man and his faithful companion. And the unbreakable spirit that could weather any storm. Jake curled up next to the crate of puppies, his body still shielding them even in the safety of the farmhouse. As he drifted off into an exhausted sleep, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. For now, though, they were safe, they were warm, and they were loved. And that was all that mattered. The days following the storm were a blur of activity on the Callahan farm. The floodwaters had receded, leaving behind a landscape transformed. Fields that had once been lush and green were now muddy expanses dotted with debris. The old red barn, which had stood strong against countless storms, now leaned slightly, its foundation weakened by the relentless waters. Henry Callahan stood on his porch, surveying the damage with a heavy heart. His calloused hands gripped a mug of steaming coffee, the warmth a stark contrast to the chill that had settled in his bones. Beside him, Jake sat faithfully, his golden fur still matted and muddy from his ordeal. "Well, boy," Henry sighed, his voice gruff with emotion, "looks like we've got our work cut out for us." Jake whined softly in response, his brown eyes fixed on the barn where his adventure had begun. The puppies were safe now, nestled in a makeshift pen in the farmhouse kitchen. But Jake couldn't shake the memory of that terrifying night, the feel of the icy water, the weight of the crate as he fought against the current. As if reading his thoughts, Henry reached down to scratch behind Jake's ears. "You did good, Jake. Real good. Don't know what would have happened to those pups if it weren't for you." The sound of tires on gravel drew their attention. A battered pickup truck was making its way up the muddy driveway, its engine sputtering and coughing. Henry recognized it immediately. It was his neighbor, Tom Wilson, from the farm down the road. Tom climbed out of the truck, his boots squelching in the mud. He was a tall man with a weathered face and kind eyes, the sort of neighbor who'd give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. "Morning, Henry," he called out, making his way to the porch. "Thought you might could use a hand." Henry's face broke into a relieved smile. "Tom, you're a sight for sore eyes. Come on up and have some coffee." As the two men settled onto the porch steps, Jake moved between them, accepting pets from both. The conversation flowed easily, two old friends assessing the damage and making plans for recovery. Tom had brought news from town. The storm had hit Oakville hard, but the community was already rallying, neighbors helping neighbors to clean up and rebuild. "Heard you had some excitement here," Tom said, nodding towards Jake. "Mary down at the diner said you found a litter of pups in the barn?" Henry chuckled, shaking his head in amazement. "Sure did. Jake here's been keeping a secret family. Brought 'em through the flood, if you can believe it." Tom whistled low, impressed. "That's some dog you got there, Henry." As they talked, more trucks began to arrive. Word had spread about the Callahan farm, and folks from all over Oakville were coming to help. Men with chainsaws to clear fallen trees, women with casseroles and sandwiches to feed the workers, even the local vet had come to check on the puppies. Jake watched it all with wide eyes, staying close to Henry's side. He wasn't used to so much activity on the quiet farm, but he could sense the good intentions of these strangers. Still, when the vet asked to see the puppies, Jake was right there, supervising every move. Dr. Sarah Thompson, a young woman with a gentle touch and a way with animals, examined each puppy carefully. "They're in remarkably good shape, considering what they've been through," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "You've done a wonderful job, Jake." Jake's tail wagged at the praise, but his eyes never left his puppies. Max, the biggest of the litter, was trying to climb out of the pen, his little paws scrabbling at the sides. Daisy was curled up in a corner, watching the proceedings with curious eyes. Buddy and Charlie were wrestling playfully, seemingly unaffected by their recent ordeal. And little Rusty, the runt of the litter, was nestled against Jake's side, seeking comfort in his father's presence. As the day wore on, the farm slowly began to take shape again. Fallen branches were cleared, debris was hauled away, and the barn was shored up with temporary supports. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air, punctuated by shouts and laughter as the community came together to help one of their own. Henry found himself overwhelmed by the generosity of his neighbors. It had been a long time since he'd had so many people on the farm. Since Sarah had passed, he'd kept to himself, finding solace in the quiet routine of farm life and Jake's steady companionship. But now, watching his friends and neighbors work tirelessly to help him rebuild, he felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the hot coffee in his hand. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the newly cleared fields, Henry called for everyone's attention. Standing on his porch, with Jake at his side and the puppies peeking out from their pen in the kitchen behind him, he cleared his throat. "Folks," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't rightly know how to thank you all. What you've done here today, well, it means more than I can say." He paused, looking out at the sea of tired, muddy faces. "I've been keeping to myself too much these past few years, and that's on me. But seeing all of you here, helping without even being asked, it reminds me of what community really means." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd. Tom stepped forward, clapping Henry on the shoulder. "That's what neighbors are for, Henry. We take care of our own." As the impromptu gathering broke up, people heading home with promises to return the next day, Henry found himself alone on the porch once more. The farm was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the lonely silence he'd grown used to, but a peaceful quiet, filled with the promise of new beginnings. Jake nudged Henry's hand, looking up at him with those soulful brown eyes. Henry smiled, scratching the dog's ears. "You know, "Boy," he said softly, "I think things are gonna be different around here from now on." That night, as Henry settled into his bed, he found he couldn't sleep. His mind was racing with plans for the farm, ideas for improvements he'd been putting off for too long. The storm had been devastating, but it had also washed away some of the stagnation that had settled over his life. He got up, moving quietly so as not to disturb Jake and the puppies, who were all sleeping soundly in the kitchen. Grabbing a notepad and pen, he sat at the kitchen table and began to write. Plans for repairing the barn, ideas for crop rotation, even thoughts about possibly expanding the farm's operations. As he wrote, he glanced over at Jake and the puppies. The sight of them, this unexpected family that had come into his life, filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He'd been going through the motions for so long, but now he had a reason to build something, to create a legacy. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. True to their word, the people of Oakville continued to show up, helping Henry bring his plans to life. The barn was not just repaired, but improved, with new stalls and a reinforced foundation. The fields were cleared and replanted, with Henry taking Tom's advice on some new drought-resistant crops. Through it all, Jake was a constant presence, dividing his time between helping Henry and caring for his puppies. As the days passed, the puppies grew stronger and more adventurous. They began to explore the farmhouse, then the yard, always under Jake's watchful eye. Henry found himself enjoying their antics, laughing more than he had in years. He started to think about the future, about what would happen when the puppies were old enough to leave. The thought of the farm being quiet again didn't sit well with him. One evening, as he and Jake sat on the porch watching the puppies play in the yard, Henry made a decision. "What do you think, Jake?" he asked, looking down at his faithful companion. "Think we might be able to handle keeping one or two of these little rascals around?" Jake's tail thumped against the porch boards, his eyes bright with what Henry could have sworn was happiness. It was settled then. The Callahan farm would never be the same, and that was just fine with both of them. As the sun set on another day, Henry looked out over his land. The scars of the storm were still visible, but they were fading. New growth was sprouting in the fields, the barn stood strong and proud, and the sound of puppies playing filled the air. It wasn't the life he had expected, but as he sat there with Jake by his side, Henry Callahan knew it was the life he was meant to have. The storm had changed everything, but in its wake, it had left something precious, a new beginning, a chance to rebuild not just a farm, but a life. And as the first stars began to twinkle in the twilight sky, Henry made a silent promise to himself, to Jake, and to the memory of Sarah. He would make the most of this second chance, this unexpected gift. The Callahan farm would thrive again, filled with life, love, and the joyful chaos of a growing family. As summer faded into fall, the Callahan farm hummed with a new energy. The once devastated fields now boasted rows of thriving crops, their leaves turning golden in the crisp autumn air. The barn, repaired and reinforced, stood prouder than ever, its red paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. But the most significant change wasn't in the buildings or the fields, it was in the spirit of the place, and in Henry Callahan himself. Henry whistled as he worked, a tune he hadn't sung in years. It was an old country song Sarah used to love, and for the first time since her passing, the memory brought a smile to his face instead of a pang of grief. He paused in his task of mending a fence, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana, and looked out over his land. In the distance, he could see Jake romping with the puppies in a field of wildflowers. The golden retriever had taken to fatherhood like a duck to water, his patience seemingly endless as he guided his rambunctious brood through the ins and outs of farm life. The puppies, now almost 4 months old, were growing by leaps and bounds, their personalities becoming more distinct with each passing day. Max, the largest of the litter, was always at the forefront of their adventures, his tail wagging with unbridled enthusiasm. Daisy, sweet and gentle, often hung back, watching her brother's antics with an almost human-like bemusement. Buddy and Charlie remained as inseparable as ever, finishing each other's barks as they explored every nook and cranny of the farm. And little Rusty, no longer quite so little, had developed a knack for finding the sunniest spots for afternoon naps. Henry chuckled as he watched Jake trying to herd the puppies back towards the house. It was like watching a furry comedy routine, with Jake darting back and forth, trying to keep all 5 puppies moving in the same direction. More often than not, just as he'd get 4 of them in line, the 5th would make a break for freedom, sending Jake scrambling. "Need some help there, old boy?" Henry called out, setting down his tools and making his way towards the canine family. At the sound of Henry's voice, all 6 dogs perked up. The puppies came bounding towards him, a golden wave of wagging tails and lolling tongues. Jake trotted behind them, looking simultaneously proud and relieved. Henry knelt down, letting the puppies swarm around him. Their excited yips and warm, squirming bodies never failed to bring a smile to his face. "All right, you little rascals," he laughed, trying to pet all 5 at once. "I think it's about time for your dinner, isn't it?" The word dinner set off a new round of excited barking. Henry stood up, brushing off his jeans, and began to lead the pack back to the house. Jake fell into step beside him, and Henry reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "You're doing a fine job with these pups, Jake," Henry said softly. "Sarah would have loved to see this." As they approached the farmhouse, Henry's eyes fell on the porch swing. It was new, a project he'd undertaken with Tom's help a few weeks back. Sarah had always wanted one, but somehow they'd never gotten around to it. Now, as he watched it sway gently in the breeze, Henry felt a sense of peace wash over him. It was as if Sarah was there, smiling her approval at the changes he'd made. Inside the kitchen, Henry set about preparing dinner for the dogs. He'd started making their food himself, a mix of ground beef, vegetables, and rice that the vet had recommended. It was more work than just opening a bag of kibble, but seeing how the puppies thrived on it made it worth the effort. As he worked, Henry's mind wandered to the future. The puppies were growing fast, and soon they'd be old enough to leave for homes of their own. He'd already decided to keep Max. The big pup had wormed his way into Henry's heart with his goofy grin and boundless energy. But the thought of the others leaving still tugged at his heartstrings. A knock at the door interrupted his musings. Wiping his hands on a dish towel, Henry went to answer it, the dogs hot on his heels. "Evening, Henry," Tom Wilson greeted him, tipping his hat. "Hope I'm not interrupting dinner." "Not at all, Tom. Come on in," Henry replied, ushering his friend inside. The puppies swarmed around Tom's feet, tails wagging in greeting. Tom laughed, bending down to pet the excited pups. "These little ones sure have grown, haven't they? Bet they're keeping you busy." Henry nodded, a proud smile on his face. "That they are. Never a dull moment around here these days." The 2 men made their way to the living room, settling into comfortable chairs. Jake curled up at Henry's feet, while the puppies continued their excited exploration of the room. "So, what brings you by, Tom?" Henry asked, sensing that this wasn't just a social call. Tom leaned forward, his expression serious but his eyes twinkling with excitement. "Well, Henry, I've been thinking. You remember how we talked about maybe expanding the farm's operations?" Henry nodded, his interest piqued. They'd discussed the idea a few times over the past months, but it had remained just that, an idea. "Well," Tom continued, "I think I might have found a way to make it happen. You know the old Johnson place down the road?" Henry raised an eyebrow. The Johnson farm had been abandoned for years, its fields lying fallow and its buildings slowly crumbling. "What about it?" "It's going up for auction next month. Now, I know what you're thinking, neither of us has the cash to buy it outright. But I've been talking to the bank, and they're willing to give us a loan if we go in on it together." Henry sat back, stunned. The possibility of expanding his farm, of building something bigger, had been a dream he'd barely allowed himself to consider. But now, with Tom's proposal, it suddenly seemed within reach. "Think about it, Henry," Tom pressed on, his enthusiasm infectious. "With your crops and my cattle, we could turn those 2 properties into something really special. A real legacy for our kids." Henry's eyes drifted to the mantelpiece, where a photo of Sarah smiled down at him. He could almost hear her voice, urging him to take the chance, to build the future they'd always talked about. "It's a big step, Tom," Henry said slowly, his mind racing with possibilities. "But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't interested." Tom grinned, clapping Henry on the shoulder. "That's what I hoped you'd say. We don't have to decide anything tonight. Just think it over, talk to Jake here," he added with a wink. He seems like a pretty good judge of character. As if on cue, Jake lifted his head, looking between the two men with those soulful brown eyes. Henry couldn't help but chuckle. That he is, Tom. That he is. The rest of the evening passed in comfortable conversation, the two old friends discussing their potential venture, sharing stories, and laughing at the puppy's antics. By the time Tom left, the sun had long since set, and a blanket of stars twinkled overhead. Henry stood on the porch, watching Tom's truck disappear down the driveway. Jake sat beside him, a comforting presence in the cool night air. "Well, boy," Henry said softly, "what do you think? Are we ready for a new adventure?" Jake looked up at him, tail thumping against the porch boards. In those warm brown eyes, Henry saw the same spirit that had driven Jake to save his puppies during the flood, a willingness to face whatever challenges lay ahead, as long as they faced them together. Henry smiled, reaching down to ruffle Jake's fur. "Yeah, I think so too." As they turned to head back inside, Henry paused for a moment, looking out over his land. The fields stretched out before him, bathed in moonlight. But now, instead of seeing the boundaries of his property, he saw possibility. The chance to grow, to build, to create something lasting. The puppies were waiting just inside the door, their little faces peering out curiously. Henry felt his heart swell with affection. This unexpected family, Jake, the puppies, even old Tom, had brought new life to the Callahan farm. They'd shown him that there was still room for growth, for change, for hope. As Henry closed the door behind him, he felt a sense of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make. But for now, surrounded by the warmth of his home and the love of his furry family, Henry Callahan knew one thing for certain: the best was yet to come. The night settled over the Callahan farm, peaceful and full of promise. In the kitchen, the puppies curled up in their bed, a tangle of golden fur and gentle snores. Jake took his usual spot at the foot of Henry's bed, ever watchful, ever loyal. And Henry, for the first time in years, fell asleep with a smile on his face, dreaming of the future. A future bright with possibility, rich with love, and full of unexpected joys. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, the Callahan farm stirred to life once more. Another day was beginning, bringing with it new opportunities, new challenges, and the promise of adventures yet to come. The storm that had once threatened to destroy everything had instead become the catalyst for a new beginning. And as the sun rose on this new day, it shone down on a farm, and a family, reborn, ready to face whatever the future might bring, together. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of freshly turned earth and the promise of change as Henry Callahan stood at the edge of his property, surveying the land that stretched out before him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the fields, highlighting the gentle undulations of the terrain. In the distance, the old Johnson place stood silent, its weathered buildings a testament to years of neglect. Henry took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. Today was the day of the auction, and his stomach churned with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He and Tom had spent weeks poring over finances, making plans, and dreaming of possibilities. Now, it all came down to this. A soft whine at his feet drew Henry's attention. Jake sat beside him, his brown eyes fixed on Henry's face, sensing his human's nervous energy. Henry smiled, reaching down to scratch behind the golden retriever's ears. "What do you think, boy?" Henry asked softly. "Are we making the right choice here?" Jake's tail thumped against the ground, his doggy grin seeming to say, "Of course we are." Henry chuckled, drawing strength from Jake's unwavering support. "Yeah, I think so too." The sound of tires on gravel announced Tom's arrival. His old pickup truck rumbled up the driveway, coming to a stop next to Henry's tractor. Tom climbed out, his face a mask of determination tinged with the same nervous energy Henry felt. "Morning, Henry," Tom called out, striding over. "Big day, huh?" Henry nodded, clasping his friend's hand in a firm shake. "That it is, Tom. That it is." The two men stood for a moment, looking out over the land that could soon be theirs. The potential was obvious. With proper care and management, the Johnson place could be brought back to life, doubling the size of their operation and opening up new possibilities. "You ready for this?" Tom asked, his voice quiet but steady. Henry took another deep breath, then nodded. As ready as I'll ever be. Let's do it. They climbed into Tom's truck, Jake hopping into the back with his usual enthusiasm. As they drove towards town, Henry's mind wandered to the puppies he'd left at home. They were nearly 6 months old now, full of energy and mischief. Max, who Henry had decided to keep, was turning into a fine dog, showing the same loyalty and intelligence as his father. The others, Daisy, Buddy, Charlie, and little Rusty, were growing more independent by the day. The thought of the puppies brought a pang to Henry's heart. He knew the day was coming when he'd have to find homes for the ones he couldn't keep. It was a bittersweet reality, one he'd been putting off facing. But today, with its promise of new beginnings, seemed to bring everything into sharp focus. The auction was being held at the Oakville Community Center, a place Henry hadn't visited in years. As they pulled into the parking lot, he was surprised to see how many cars were already there. It seemed the whole town had turned out for the event. Inside, the main hall was buzzing with activity. Farmers, real estate agents, and curious onlookers milled about, their voices creating a low hum of excitement. Henry and Tom made their way to the registration desk, picking up their bidder numbers with hands that shook only slightly. As they found seats near the front, Henry was struck by a wave of nostalgia. The last time he'd been in this room was for the fall festival, years ago. Sarah had been by his side then, her hand warm in his as they'd watched the local kids perform in the talent show. The memory, once painful, now brought a smile to his face. The auctioneer's voice cut through Henry's reverie, calling the room to order. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to auction off the Johnson property." Henry listened intently as the auctioneer described the land, 200 acres of prime Missouri farmland, with a farmhouse, 2 barns, and various outbuildings. It was more than Henry had ever dreamed of owning, but sitting there with Tom, it suddenly seemed within reach. The bidding started slowly, with a few tentative offers from local real estate developers. Henry and Tom had agreed on their strategy: wait until the bidding slowed, then come in strong. As the price climbed, Henry felt his palms begin to sweat. This was it, the moment of truth. Just as Henry was about to raise his paddle, a commotion at the back of the room caught everyone's attention. The doors burst open, and a familiar golden blur came bounding down the aisle. "Jake!" Henry gasped, recognizing his faithful companion instantly. But Jake wasn't alone. Hot on his heels came 5 smaller blurs, the puppies, all grown now, but still unmistakable. They barreled down the aisle, ignoring the startled cries of the attendees, making a beeline for Henry. Before Henry could react, he was surrounded by a sea of wagging tails and excited barks. Jake pressed against his legs, looking up at him with those soulful brown eyes, while the puppies clambered for his attention. The room erupted in laughter and oaths, the tense atmosphere of the auction broken by the unexpected canine invasion. Henry, his face red with embarrassment but his heart swelling with love, tried to calm the excited dogs. "I'm so sorry," he called out to the room at large, "I don't know how they got here." But his apology was cut short by a new voice, one that made his heart skip a beat. "Henry Callahan, your dogs are as stubborn as you are." Henry's head snapped up, his eyes widening in disbelief. There, standing in the doorway, was a face he hadn't seen in years but would recognize anywhere. "Emily," he breathed, hardly daring to believe his eyes. Emily Johnson, Sarah's younger sister, stood framed in the doorway, her hands on her hips and a wry smile on her face. She looked older than Henry remembered, with streaks of gray in her auburn hair, but her green eyes still sparkled with the same mischief they had when she was young. "Well, don't just stand there catching flies," Emily said, striding down the aisle. "Aren't you going to say hello to your sister-in-law?" Henry stood, his legs shaky, and embraced Emily. The years melted away, and suddenly he was transported back to happier times, when Sarah was alive and the farm was full of laughter. "What are you doing here?" Henry asked when they finally pulled apart. Emily's smile faltered slightly. "I heard about the auction. I couldn't bear the thought of strangers buying up my family's land. But when I got here and saw your truck outside, well, I had a feeling you might be up to something." Henry nodded, suddenly understanding. "The Johnson place, it was your family's farm?" 5 generations, Emily confirmed. I grew up there, same as my dad and his dad before him. When my parents passed, and I was off living my big city life, I thought selling it was the right thing to do. But now." Her voice trailed off, her eyes misty with emotion. Henry felt a lump form in his throat. He knew all too well the pain of letting go of family legacy. The auctioneer cleared his throat, clearly unsure how to proceed in the face of this family drama. Folks, should we continue?" Henry looked at Tom, then at Emily, an idea forming in his mind. "Emily," he said slowly, "how would you feel about becoming partners in this venture?" Emily's eyes widened. "Partners?" Tom stepped forward, catching on to Henry's plan. "We were planning to buy the property, expand our operations. But with your connection to the land, your knowledge, well, 3 heads are better than 2, right?" Emily looked between the 2 men, then down at the dogs still milling around their feet. A slow smile spread across her face. "You know what? I think Sarah would have loved that idea." And just like that, the auction took on a new energy. With Emily on their team, bringing her own resources and determination to the table, their bid was unbeatable. By the time the gavel fell, the Johnson property, soon to be the Callahan-Wilson Johnson farm, was theirs. As they signed the paperwork, Henry felt a sense of rightness settle over him. This wasn't just a business transaction, it was a reunion, a healing, a new chapter in a story that had seemed finished. Outside the community center, with the autumn sun warm on their faces, Henry, Tom, and Emily stood surrounded by the dogs, all of whom seemed to sense the importance of the moment. Jake sat proudly at Henry's feet, while the puppies, no longer puppies, really bounded around in excitement. Emily knelt down, letting the dogs sniff her hands. "So, are you going to introduce me to this motley crew?" Henry laughed, the sound rich and full. "Well, you've met Jake, of course. And these troublemakers are his kids. That's Max, Daisy, Buddy, Charlie, and little Rusty." As he said each name, the corresponding dog perked up, tails wagging even faster. Emily laughed in delight. "They're wonderful, Henry. Sarah would have adored them." A comfortable silence fell over the group as they all took in the magnitude of the day's events. Finally, Tom spoke up. "So, partners, what's our first move?" Henry looked out over the town, towards the rolling hills where their new, expanded farm waited. He thought of Sarah, of the dreams they'd shared, of the future they'd planned. He thought of Jake and the puppies, of the courage and love they'd shown. And he thought of this unexpected reunion, this chance to bring a family back together. "First," Henry said, a smile spreading across his face, "I think we need to get these 4-legged escape artists home. And then we start building something amazing." As they piled into their vehicles, dogs and all, Henry felt a sense of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would be challenging, no doubt, but with friends both old and new by his side, he was ready to face whatever came their way. The Callahan farm and the Callahan family was growing in ways Henry could never have imagined. And as they drove home, the autumn sun warm on their faces and the promise of new beginnings in the air, Henry knew that the best was yet to come. The weeks following the auction flew by in a whirlwind of activity. The Callahan farm, once a quiet haven for Henry and his canine companions, now buzzed with the energy of new beginnings. The merger of the Callahan and Johnson properties into a single, sprawling operation was no small feat, but Henry, Tom, and Emily threw themselves into the work with enthusiasm that belied their years. Each crisp autumn morning found Henry up before dawn, a steaming mug of coffee in hand as he stood on his porch, watching the sun rise over his expanded domain. Jake, ever faithful, would sit beside him, his tail thumping softly against the wooden boards. These quiet moments, before the day's hustle and bustle began, became Henry's favorite time to reflect on how much his life had changed in such a short span of time. "You know, Jake," Henry mused one such morning, his breath visible in the cool air, "I never thought I'd see the day when this old place would be full of life again. Sarah would have loved this." Jake looked up at him, those soulful brown eyes seeming to understand every word. Henry smiled, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Yeah, I think so too, boy." As if on cue, the sound of a slamming screen door and excited barks broke the morning stillness. Emily emerged from the farmhouse, her auburn hair tied back in a messy ponytail, Max and Daisy bounding at her heels. "Morning, Henry," she called out cheerfully. "Ready to tackle that north field today?" Henry chuckled, shaking his head in amused disbelief. Emily's energy was infectious, and he found himself looking forward to each day's tasks with an enthusiasm he hadn't felt in years. "Ready as I'll ever be," he replied, draining the last of his coffee. "Let's get to it." The work was hard, but rewarding. Merging the two farms meant not just combining land, but integrating different systems, crops, and ways of doing things. Tom's expertise with cattle complemented Henry's skill with crops, while Emily brought fresh ideas and a knack for organization that kept them all on track. As they worked to bring the old Johnson place back to life, Henry found himself sharing stories of his life with Sarah, memories he'd kept locked away for too long. Emily, in turn, filled in gaps in the family history, her tales of growing up on the farm bringing new depth to Henry's understanding of the land he now called his own. The dogs, of course, were constant companions through it all. Jake took to farm life with the same steady determination he showed in everything, while Max was quickly proving himself to be a chip off the old block. Daisy, Buddy, Charlie, and Rusty each found their own niches. Daisy became Emily's shadow, while Buddy and Charlie appointed themselves official greeters for anyone who visited the farm. Rusty, still the smallest but no less spirited, became an expert at finding lost tools, his keen nose saving the humans hours of searching on more than one occasion. As autumn deepened into winter, the farm settled into a new rhythm. The days grew shorter and colder, but inside the farmhouse, warmth and laughter prevailed. Evening meals became a cherished ritual, with Henry, Emily, and often Tom gathered around the big kitchen table, sharing the day's triumphs and challenges while the dogs dozed contentedly by the fireplace. It was during one such evening, with snow falling gently outside and the smell of Emily's apple pie filling the air, that Henry realized just how much his life had changed. He looked around the table at the faces of his friends, no, his family, and felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly took his breath away. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice gruff with emotion, "about the puppies." Emily and Tom exchanged glances. They knew this had been weighing on Henry's mind. While Max had always been destined to stay on the farm, the future of the other four had remained uncertain. "What about them?" Emily asked gently. Henry took a deep breath. I think it's time we found them their forever homes." The words hung in the air for a moment. Then Tom nodded slowly. "I think you're right, Henry. They're good dogs. They deserve families of their own. But," Emily added, a twinkle in her eye, "I have a feeling you've got more than that on your mind." Henry couldn't help but smile. Emily had always been perceptive, just like Sarah. "Well," he said, "I've been thinking about that too. And I've got an idea." Over pie and coffee, Henry laid out his plan. The Callahan-Wilson-Johnson farm was thriving, but he saw potential for more than just crops and cattle. Why not use their success, and the remarkable story of Jake and his puppies, to help other animals in need? "We've got the space," Henry explained, warming to his theme. "We could set up a small rescue operation. Take in dogs that need a second chance, give them a place to heal and learn, like Jake did for his pups during the flood. And then find them homes with folks who'll love them like family." Emily's eyes lit up. "Henry, that's a wonderful idea. We could work with local shelters, maybe even train some of the dogs for therapy work." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "It'd be good for the community, too. Bring people out to the farm, maybe do some education programs about responsible pet ownership." As they discussed the idea, fleshing out details and possibilities, Henry felt a sense of purpose settling over him. This was more than just a business venture. It was a way to honor Sarah's memory, to build on the legacy of love and compassion she'd always embodied. The next few months were a flurry of activity as they put their plan into action. The old Johnson barn, once dilapidated and forgotten, was renovated into a state-of-the-art rescue center. Local volunteers, touched by the story of Jake's heroism during the flood, came out in droves to help. Daisy, Buddy, Charlie, and Rusty did eventually find their forever homes, but not before playing a crucial role in getting the rescue operation off the ground. Their gentle natures and impeccable manners, thanks to Jake's patient guidance, made them perfect ambassadors for the program. Daisy went home with the Andersons, a young couple who'd recently moved to Oakville. Her calm demeanor made her the perfect companion for their newborn daughter, and Henry knew Sarah would have approved of the match. Buddy and Charlie, true to their inseparable nature, were adopted together by the Johnsons, a retired couple with a big house and an even bigger hearts. The twins' antics kept the Johnsons young at heart, their days filled with laughter and doggy kisses. Rusty, the little runt who'd grown into a dog with a heart as big as his dad's, found his calling as a therapy dog. He went to live with Dr. Thompson, the vet who'd cared for the puppies since their birth, and began visiting hospitals and nursing homes, bringing joy to those who needed it most. As spring bloomed across the Missouri countryside, the Callahan-Wilson-Johnson farm hosted its first official event, a community day, to introduce the rescue program and celebrate new beginnings. The turnout was beyond anything they could have imagined. Families from all over the county came to tour the farm, meet the animals, and learn about the rescue operation. Jake, now a distinguished senior citizen in the dog world, took it all in stride. He sat regally by Henry's side as the farmer welcomed visitors, his presence a living testament to the power of love and second chances. Max, fully grown and the spitting image of his father, had taken on the role of official greeter, his tail wagging non-stop as he charmed visitors young and old. He'd inherited not just Jake's looks, but his gentle spirit and unwavering loyalty. As the day wound down, Henry found a quiet moment to slip away. He made his way to the old oak tree where, not so long ago, Jake had sheltered his puppies from the flood. A simple plaque now adorned the trunk, commemorating Jake's bravery and the new life that had sprung from that harrowing night. Henry ran his fingers over the engraved words, feeling the weight of all that had happened since then. He thought of Sarah, of the life they'd shared and the dreams they'd had for this land. He thought of Emily, and how her unexpected return had brought healing and joy. He thought of Tom, whose friendship had been a constant through good times and bad. And he thought of Jake, the loyal companion who had started it all. As if summoned by Henry's thoughts, the old dog appeared at his side, pressing against his leg in that familiar, comforting way. "Well, old friend," Henry said softly, looking out over the farm that had become so much more than he'd ever imagined, "I'd say we did all right, didn't we?" Jake's tail thumped against the ground, his doggy grin seeming to say, "We sure did, Henry. We sure did." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Henry and Jake made their way back to the farmhouse. The sounds of laughter and friendly conversation drifted on the evening breeze, a testament to the community they'd built. Henry paused on the porch, taking it all in. The expanded farm, thriving and full of life. The rescue center, a beacon of hope for animals in need. And most importantly, the family he'd found, not just Emily and Tom, but all the people and animals who'd become part of this grand adventure. It wasn't the life he'd planned, all those years ago when he and Sarah had first started out. But as he stood there, with Jake by his side and the warmth of friendship and purpose filling his heart, Henry Callahan knew one thing for certain. It was the life he was meant to have. A life built on love, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. A life of new beginnings, second chances, and the endless possibilities that come when you open your heart to the unexpected. As Henry stepped inside, ready to join the others and look to the future, he couldn't help but smile. The best, he knew, was yet to come.